This is one of the saddest and creepiest true stories from Georgia's past. Before we start, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now for you. We want to know what places and times these stories reach. Back in the fall of 1843, when the cotton fields were blooming all over Wilkes County, Georgia, something started happening at a place called Whitaker Plantation. And this story stayed hidden in old county papers for over 100 years. The plantation was about 17 miles southeast of Washington, Georgia. It was a fancy, rich place with big white columns you could see from the main road that connected Augusta and Athens. Old church papers from the Presbyterian Church say that the lady of the house, Charlotte Whitaker, wife of Colonel James Whitaker, gave birth to triplets on September 8th. That was super rare back then, so it got written down in church books and even got a mention in the Augusta newspaper's society pages. But here's the thing, the newspaper never told anyone what happened to the third baby. The Whitaker family had been in Georgia since 1776. Back then, a British loyalist named Edmund Whitaker switched sides after he saw how badly British soldiers were treating people in Savannah. His grandson James grew the family's money a lot, and by 1830 he was one of the biggest landowners in Wilkes County. Church records show he married Charlotte Montgomery, whose family was a big deal in Charleston back in 1835. From what old letters and papers show, their marriage looked good and normal. They had 2 sons pretty quickly. Other plantation wives who wrote letters said Charlotte had great taste, was pretty strict, and ran her house really well. Now here's Ruth Anne Turner. She first shows up in tax papers from 1838 when she was bought along with 5 other workers for the Whitaker house. Old lists show she was Charlotte's personal helper. We wouldn't know much else about her except that weird notes started showing up in Charlotte's household notebook, which was found during work on the courthouse in 1962. The notebook got water damaged, but you can still read parts of it. It has regular house stuff like supplies, but also strange notes tracking Ruth Ann's monthly cycle, marked with little X's in the corner. Those notes just stopped suddenly in January 1843, right around when Charlotte probably found out she was pregnant. That summer of 1843 was really hot and dry in Georgia. Weather notes kept by the local minister, Reverend Samuel Cartwright, say it didn't rain in Wilkes County from June 7th all the way to August 23rd. Crops died, animals struggled, and everyone was on edge. That was the season Charlotte's pregnancy went on. Letters from neighbors say she stopped going to social events by July, which was weird for her because she usually stayed busy right up until the baby came. A letter from an Augusta doctor, Dr. William Harrison, to Colonel Whitaker on August 1st hints something wasn't right. It says her condition needed total rest and no stress at all, that her pregnancy was unusual and needed extra care. Nobody ever wrote down exactly what was unusual about it, but people have pieced the story together from different sources: church birth records, house lists, and most importantly, part of a journal found in 1959 when the old east wing of the Whitaker house was being torn down. That journal is believed to be Ruth Anne Turner's, based on comparing the handwriting to her mark on old sale papers. It has 12 pages, written the way the words sound, which suggests she secretly taught herself to write. Those pages are now kept safe at the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah, and they're the only account we have from someone who was actually there on the night of September 8th. According to Ruth Ann's journal, Charlotte went into labor just after midnight. Colonel Whitaker was away on business in Augusta. The local midwife, Mrs. Abernathy, got called, but by the time she showed up, the first baby was already born with Ruth Ann's help. Everyone knew twins were coming. Dr. Harrison had figured that out during his checkups. Nobody expected a third baby. Here's what Ruth Anne wrote. The third baby came after Miss Charlotte thought she was already done. It was small and quiet and much darker skinned than the other 2. Charlotte looked at it and her face changed. She said, "This one never breathed, you understand? Take it away. Bury it deep where no one will find it." But the baby cried when Ruth Anne wrapped it up. What happened next only comes in little pieces. Ruth Anne, based on her journal, didn't bury the baby. Instead, she took it back to her own quarters behind the main house. Her journal entries get more and more nervous as she writes about trying to take care of the baby while still doing her regular chores. Keep her quiet when people are near. Feed her when I can sneak away. Miss Charlotte watches me now. Her eyes follow me. She knows something. The last readable entry, written about 3 weeks after the birth, says, "Colonel comes back tomorrow. Miss Charlotte says she'll tell him I stole silver, says they'll sell me south. I'm taking the baby tonight. The North Star will guide us." County records back this up. In October 1843, Ruth Anne Turner was reported as a runaway. A notice in the Augusta paper on October 12 offered $200 for her return and said she may have stolen things from the house. It didn't mention any baby. Around that same time, Dr. Harrison's records show he treated Charlotte Whitaker for nervous exhaustion through October and November, giving her laudanum and telling her to stay in bed. The public story about the Whitaker triplets got settled fast. County birth records only list 2 kids, Thomas James and William Montgomery Whitaker. Church baptism records from November 1843 list the same 2 boys. The colonel and his wife were back out in society by spring, and letters from neighbors talk about the handsome Whitaker twins showing up at parties. On the surface, everything looked fine, but something was still off inside that house. Over the next year, the house went through a lot of staff changes. Workers kept coming and going. Charlotte's letters, kept at the University of Georgia archive, show she was getting more and more worried about keeping the property safe. In a letter to her sister in Charleston from March 1844, she writes, "We've had to replace most of the house staff. They were unreliable and talked too much. James hired a man just to patrol the grounds at night because people have been sneaking onto the edges of the property. I can barely sleep most nights." Colonel Whitaker's business records show he paid a Pinkerton detective a lot of money between April and August 1844. Nobody wrote down exactly why, but county records do show he bought extra land 2 miles from the main house, a small plot with a cabin that stayed empty on paper but was kept as part of the estate. Old stories collected in the 1930s say this cabin was kept for guests who needed privacy, though no visitor was ever officially recorded staying there. 5 years went by with barely any paper trail about what happened in 1843. The Whitaker twins grew up with a bunch of nurses and tutors. Charlotte kept her spot in local society, though letters from other women mentioned she was getting more religious and a little sad sometimes. Colonel Whitaker grew his businesses and traveled a lot to Augusta, Savannah, and Charleston. Life at the plantation seemed totally normal again. Then came the fall of 1848. County medical records say a fever spread through Wilkes County and hit a lot of families. The Whitaker twins, now 5 years old, both got sick. Dr. Harrison's records say he treated both boys, but he couldn't save William, who died on October 23rd. That's where the records get weird. Church burial records confirm William's funeral and burial in the family plot. But Dr. Harrison's personal diary, found after he died and now kept at the Medical College of Georgia, has a strange entry from October 25th. It says, "Called to Whitaker Plantation again today. This makes no medical sense. Mrs. W. insists the surviving boy is William, even though I treated Thomas just yesterday. Colonel W. pulled me aside and said the boys looked so alike that in their grief they must have mixed up the names. I'm not totally convinced, but it's not my place to push further." This mix-up over which twin actually survived shows up in a few places. The tutor's notes from November 1848 first call the surviving boy Thomas, then that name gets crossed out and changed to William. By January 1849, every house record calls him William. A letter from Charlotte to her mother in Charleston from December 1848 says, "God, in his wisdom, chose to save our dear William. We grieve for Thomas, but we're grateful for the son who's still with us." William grows stronger every day and is doing really well in his studies. Here's the creepy part. A note in Ruth Anne Turner's journal, on a page that used to be too water damaged to read but got fixed up in 1967, said something disturbing. Right after the births, she wrote that the first boy was strong and loud, the second was smaller with a little red birthmark behind his right ear, and the note about the third baby is too damaged to read. Dr. Harrison's 1843 records confirm that the twin named William had a small birthmark behind his right ear. But in his 1848 diary, he says he's confused because the surviving boy doesn't have that mark at all. Things kept changing for the Whitaker family after that. Colonel James Whitaker died suddenly in 1852, supposedly in a horse-riding accident on the property, though old local stories hint he might have taken his own life. Charlotte took over running the estate, and she did it really well. Their son, now always called William in every record, got sent to boarding school in Virginia in 1854. Charlotte stayed at the plantation, getting more isolated, according to what neighbors said. Church records show she gave a lot of money to the Presbyterian Church, paying for a new wing and stained glass windows. In 1858, something odd shows up in the records of a private detective agency in Philadelphia. Papers found during a library project in 1953 show that someone from Wilkes County, Georgia, their name blacked out, hired investigators to find a mixed-race person, about 15 years old, going to school in Pennsylvania or New York, who was traveling with a woman from Georgia who was about 40. We don't know what the investigation found, but a final payment was made in February 1859, which suggests it wrapped up. 2 months later, Charlotte Whitaker sold the plantation and most of what she owned. She moved to Savannah and bought a townhouse on Abercorn Street. She lived there, more and more alone, until she died in 1867. Her will left most of her money to her only living son, William Montgomery Whitaker, plus big donations to the Presbyterian Church in Savannah, and oddly, to a school for poor girls in Philadelphia. William Whitaker married into a well-known Savannah family in 1865 and had 3 kids. His family stayed important in Georgia into the early 1900s. Nothing in the public records shows he ever knew about what happened at his birth or that he might have had a 3rd sibling. But family letters given to the Georgia Historical Society in 1948 include one from William to his wife in 1870 where he talks about strange dreams. He writes, "I keep having this odd dream about a woman I've never met, with eyes just like mine, calling to me from far away. Mother always said it was just leftover fever from when I was little, but the dream feels so real that I wonder if it's some memory trying to come back from when I was a baby." This whole story might have stayed buried forever if it weren't for a highway project near the old Whitaker land in 1956. Workers found a small grave with no name on it, about half a mile from where the old plantation house used to stand. County coroner records say the remains belonged to a baby who died sometime in the 1840s. Nobody investigated further. The remains just got reburied in the county cemetery under a plain marker that says "Unknown Child, circa 1840s. The local newspaper barely mentioned it and people forgot about it fast. Then in 1965, a historian studying the Underground Railroad found records from a Quaker settlement in Pennsylvania. One of them, from October 1843, notes the arrival of someone with the initials RT from Georgia, along with an infant daughter. Later entries show RT learning to read and write and eventually working as a seamstress. The last mention from 1861 says RT and her daughter, E, had moved to Canada because they were worried about the Fugitive Slave Act being enforced. After that, no more trace of them shows up anywhere. Nobody knows what happened to this daughter, who was probably the missing 3rd Whitaker baby. Did she ever find out where she came from? Did she know about her brothers in Georgia? The trail just goes cold until 1876, when a strange ad showed up in a Savannah newspaper. A woman calling herself only E was looking for information about the Whitaker family, who used to live in Wilkes County. The ad ran for 3 weeks and never got a public answer. Through this whole story, one question keeps coming up. Why did Charlotte Whitaker reject her 3rd baby? Letters and records give some hints, but no clear answer. Letters between Charlotte and her mother from before her marriage show she was worried about her grandfather on her mom's side, who was described as having a Mediterranean skin tone. Dr. Harrison's private notes mention that Colonel Whitaker was worried about his wife's family history and possible issues in her bloodline. Back then, in the racial system of the pre-Civil War South, that kind of thing could ruin a whole family's reputation and future. This story shows us that the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, they come from real human hearts and the messed up systems people built. Think about the toll this must have taken on everyone. Charlotte carrying her secret and living in fear of it coming out. Ruth Anne risking everything to save a baby. The twins, one who died young and the other who grew up with dreams he couldn't explain. And that 3rd child, raised far away from Georgia, maybe never knowing her whole story. These questions just echo through time without answers. Today, the old Whitaker Plantation land is part of a national forest. Nothing's left of the old buildings except some stone bases covered in kudzu vines and pine trees. Hikers sometimes say the air feels heavy near where the old house used to be, like something is watching from the woods. Local historians say it's just people's minds reacting to knowing the sad history there. Others say it's just the Georgia heat messing with people. In 1969, all the Whitaker family records got sorted and stored at the University of Georgia, but the person cataloging them noticed pages missing from Charlotte's personal diaries and pages torn out of Ruth Anne's journal too. Some stories stay broken on purpose, pieces missing not by accident but by choice. we may never know the whole truth of what happened at Whitaker Plantation in 1843. But in the gaps, the silence, and what's missing, you can kind of see the shape of a sad human story, one built on social pressure, prejudice, and desperate attempts to keep up appearances. William Whitaker's descendants still live all over the American South today, and a lot of them probably have no idea about the circumstances of their ancestors' birth. As for descendants of that third child, the one taken to Pennsylvania and then Canada, they might be walking around right now, carrying a history they never got to learn, connected to a family that never claimed them. The past never really goes away. It just waits under the surface, shifting the ground under our feet in ways we barely notice. At the Georgia Historical Society, Ruth Anne Turner's journal pages are kept safe in a special drawer under glass. Her handwriting, careful and determined even though she barely knew how to write, tells a story of courage against impossible odds. The last readable words, partly damaged but carefully saved by experts, say, "They may erase us from their books, but our blood still flows, our story still lives. North Star, guide us now to where truth can breathe free." Maybe the scariest part of this whole story isn't what we know, it's how many similar stories never got told at all, buried in graves with no names or hidden in records with the names blacked out. The Whitaker triplets stand in for countless other lives that got shaped, and sometimes destroyed, by the systems of their time, systems whose shadow still stretches into today. The past isn't as far away as we'd like to think. It lives in our institutions, our families, our DNA, and sometimes in dreams we can't explain. As it gets dark over the Georgia pines and night falls over the old Whitaker land, picture three kids, split apart by circumstance and by society but still connected by blood, looking up at the same stars, their lives flowing off in different directions like streams from one spring. One path ended early in childhood. Another led to money and status in Southern society. The third one disappeared north like a stream flowing toward a faraway sea. All three were shaped by a single night in September 1843, when one woman made a choice, another woman defied it, and the results echoed for generations. County records show that in 1958, a woman from Toronto came to the Wilkes County courthouse asking about the Whitaker family. She never gave her name, but the clerk remembered her because of her striking eyes and unusual gray-green color. When the clerk told her most records from that time were damaged or lost, she just nodded like she expected that answer and asked for directions to the old plantation site. Nobody knows what she was looking for there or if she found it. Like a lot of threads in this story, this one just disappears into history, leaving only questions that seem to whisper through the Georgia night. In moments like this, we're left wondering not just about what history kept, but about what it hid, the quiet bravery, the secret wrongs, the kids who grew up never knowing where they really came from, and the family bonds that go beyond the categories people invented to divide each other. Maybe even now somewhere out there, descendants of all three Whitaker children are living their lives, connected by a thread they can't see but might sometimes feel a tug at the edge of a dream, or a strange feeling of recognition when they look into a stranger's eyes. The past isn't really past. It lives on underneath everything, feeding roots that reach into our lives in ways we may never fully get. This story about Charlotte Whitaker, Ruth Anne Turner, and the three kids born that September night in 1843 reminds us that every family has secrets, every community has silences, and every history book leaves things out on purpose. The real horror lives in those shadows, not in what we see, but in what stays hidden on purpose, not in what's remembered, but in what's been erased completely. More of that same Toronto woman's story comes from an unexpected place, the notes of Dr. Elena Blackwood, an anthropologist who studied oral history in rural Georgia between 1957 and 1960. Her papers, given to Emory University in 1968, not long before she died, include an interview with an old groundskeeper who took care of the Presbyterian cemetery where the Whitakers were buried. "This man, only called Mr. J," said the woman from Toronto, spent 3 days visiting the cemetery and the old plantation grounds. On the third day, he watched her place 3 white roses on William Whitaker's grave. When he walked over, she was crying quietly. "She told me she had family here once," Mr. J remembered. "When I asked who, she just said no one who would have claimed me." Before she left, she asked if he knew about any unmarked children's graves near the old plantation. He told her about the small grave found during the highway construction. She thanked him and left the next day. But here's the strange part, she left him a sealed letter to put on Colonel Whitaker's grave, saying it was a family matter. He did what she asked, but it rained that night, and by morning the letter was gone, like it had just melted away. This raises some big questions. If this woman really was a descendant of the third Whitaker child, what brought her back to Georgia after all those years? What did the letter say, and why leave it at Colonel Whitaker's grave instead of Charlotte's? The groundskeeper's story suggests she knew more about the family than most people did at the time. Local newspapers from that week don't mention any Canadian visitor, but they do report something odd: a small fire at the county records office that damaged several old deed books from the 1800s. They blamed it on faulty wiring, but the timing, the same night as the Toronto woman's last visit to the courthouse, raises questions that may never get answered. Another layer of this story showed up in 1962, when renovations to Charlotte's old Savannah home turned up a hidden compartment under a window seat in the master bedroom. Inside was a small tin box with a child's leather shoe, sized for a 3-year-old, and a folded piece of paper. That paper, according to the contractor who found it, had a list of dates, ending with October 12, 1843, the same day Ruth Anne Turner was reported as a runaway. Next to it was what looked like a tally of miles, ending with the word Pennsylvania. Sadly, the contractor's wife thought the stuff was junk and threw it out before historians could look at it. All we have now is the man's description, given to a local reporter for a small human interest story. The stress of carrying this secret must have been huge for everyone involved. Charlotte Whitaker's medical records show she was given more and more sedatives as she got older. Her Savannah doctor noted in 1862 that she had nervous exhaustion and kept having nightmares, and that she often talked in her sleep about a child in the woods and someone watching from the trees. Whether that came from guilt, fear, or something else, nobody really knows. Colonel Whitaker's part in all this is pretty unclear too. His business records show regular payments to different investigators over the years, but nobody wrote down why. After he died, Charlotte destroyed most of his personal letters. According to her maid's account, kept in church records, what he knew, what he suspected, and what he actually did stays mostly hidden from history. His death itself, a riding accident where he was found with a broken neck at the bottom of a ravine on the property, was never really looked into. The local doctor who checked his body just noted that death looked instant and that the colonel's face showed a look of extreme distress. William Whitaker, the surviving twin, or maybe actually Thomas, if Dr. Harrison's mixed-up records are right, grew up under the shadow of all this, probably without even realizing it. His school records from Virginia show he was smart but troubled, dealing with insomnia and what his headmaster called a sadness that didn't fit someone his age. He did great in school but struggled to make friends, preferring to be alone. A letter from his roommate to his parents, kept in a private collection and shared with researchers in 1970, says William often woke up at night, saying he heard a woman calling his name outside the window. "When I look, there's never anyone there, but he's still convinced," the roommate wrote. After graduating, William went to medical school in Philadelphia for a bit, but he quit after less than a year. His letter to his mother explaining why still exists. He wrote, "The dissection rooms bothered me more than I can say. Last week, when we uncovered the body we were studying, a young black woman, I started shaking so badly I had to be walked out of the room. I can't explain the reaction, but I know I can't stay in this field." He ended up going into law instead and built a successful practice in Savannah, ironically, focused on family estate cases. William's descendants have sometimes looked into their family history, but none of them ever seem to have found the full story. In 1937, one of William's granddaughters put together a family tree tracing the Whitakers back to England, but it only mentions the twins briefly, saying Thomas died young from a fever. It says nothing about a third baby. When interviewed for a county history project in 1954, William's elderly son James said his grandmother Charlotte was very religious and ran a strict household, and that his father almost never talked about his childhood. Nobody has ever traced any possible descendants of the third child. If Ruth Anne Turner and the baby girl really did make it to Pennsylvania and then Canada, they probably changed their names, maybe even their whole identities. Census records from 1870s Toronto list several mixed-race families who came from the U.S., but none of them can be clearly linked to Ruth Anne or the baby she saved. The trail just goes cold at the Canadian border, hidden by time and by the fact that a lot of formerly enslaved people understandably erased their old identities on purpose. So what happened to that possible third branch of the Whitaker family? There's one interesting clue. In 1948, a woman named Wilkes Turner published a small book of poems in Montreal called Blood Memory. The poems talk about things like dreaming of cotton fields she'd never seen and brothers lost across a line she couldn't cross. All her author bio says is that she was born in Toronto to parents who came from further south. One poem, just called Georgia, talks about walking a red clay road in a dream, to a house she'd never been in, seeing her own face looking back from portraits of strangers. Is that just a coincidence, or could Wilkes Turner have been related to Ruth Anne and that third Whitaker baby? The book is super rare now, only 3 copies are known to exist, all in private collections. The actual land where all this happened has changed a lot over the years. The Whitaker Plantation house burned down in 1879, long after the family had already left. The land got split up and sold several times before finally becoming part of a state wildlife area in 1952. Hikers and hunters who go into the more remote parts sometimes find old brick foundations, leftover bits of old buildings, and according to a 1966 newspaper story, once found a small stone marker with nothing written on it, surrounded by white wild roses, even though no other roses grow in that area. Forest Service workers have never been able to find that marker again since. The emotional side of this story, what Charlotte was feeling when she made her choice, what Ruth Anne felt when she defied it, what it was like for the separated triplets living their disconnected lives, that part is even harder to know. We can only imagine the mix of social pressure, racist beliefs, family duty, personal fear, and a mother's instinct that pushed Charlotte to reject her third baby. And we can only guess at the courage and moral strength that pushed Ruth Anne to risk everything for a baby who, under the law and by society's standards at the time, wasn't even considered fully human. What would make a mother reject her own child? History gives us some context. In the pre-Civil War South, a child who was visibly mixed race, born to a white plantation wife, would have destroyed the family's reputation and could have even led to violence. Charlotte's whole position, wealth, and identity depended on keeping the racial lines that a birth like this would have completely broken, but the emotional cost of that choice must have been huge. Her growing religious devotion, her isolation, and her reliance on sedatives all suggest a woman haunted by what she did. And what pushed Ruth Anne Turner to take such a huge risk? Besides basic human kindness, did she see this as a chance to fight back against a system that had taken away her own freedom? Or was it simply a mother's instinct to protect a helpless baby no matter what? Her journal suggests a woman of real strength and strong moral conviction, but the full reasons behind what she did stay hidden in the spaces between her carefully written words. This story shows the real horror that human societies can cause through rigid hierarchies and boundaries, horror that doesn't need anything supernatural to be scary. It reminds us that the scariest monsters aren't hiding in the dark. They live in human hearts and minds, shaped by systems that force people into impossible choices with unbearable costs. In 1967, during an oral history project about descendants of enslaved people, an interviewer in Ontario, Canada, recorded an elderly woman talking about her grandmother, who she said came from Georgia carrying secrets that could burn down a house. This woman, whose name got left out of the published collection at her request, talked about a family story where her grandmother was rescued as a baby and taken north by a woman who chose freedom for both of them. She described a family tradition of placing 3 white roses in flowing water on the same day every September, though she said nobody remembered anymore what the tradition actually meant. Could this be another thread connected to the Whitaker story? The dates line up, and the 3 white roses match the 3 babies born that September night in 1843. But like a lot of parts of this story, the connection stays uncertain, more of a possibility than a proven fact. History, especially for people who got left out of the official records, often only survives in pieces like this, family stories and traditions whose original meaning fades over time. The last documented mention connected to this story comes from a church bulletin in Savannah dated March 1867. It notes the death of Mrs. Charlotte Whitaker, widow of Colonel James Whitaker, saying she died peacefully in her sleep, though the household staff said she kept talking about forgiveness in her final hours. The short obituary ends with a Bible verse that Charlotte reportedly picked herself for her funeral from the Gospel of Matthew. "For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" Whether that verse came from real guilt, a lifetime of justifying herself, or something else entirely, is a question history can't answer for sure. Like so much of this story, it stays stuck between what we know and what we can only imagine, right in that space where the real horror usually lives. Today, every major person in this story is dead and buried. Charlotte and James Whitaker are buried in Savannah's famous Bonaventure Cemetery, with a big marble tombstone showing off their social status. The surviving twin, William, or maybe actually Thomas, is buried nearby, with a gravestone reading 1843 to 1902 and the words beloved father, husband, son. The grave of the twin who died at age 5, Thomas, or maybe actually William, is in the family plot back in Wilkes County, marked with a small stone worn smooth by time and weather. The unmarked baby's grave found during the 1956 highway project may be connected to this story, maybe not. Now sits under the asphalt of a Georgia state highway, with cars driving over it every day, drivers with no idea it's even there. As for Ruth Anne Turner and the baby she may have saved, they have no known graves at all, no markers, no place where anyone could go lay flowers. What happened to them after that October night in 1843 lives mostly in the world of maybe instead of documented fact. But the fact that they're missing from official records is, in its own way, proof of courage, proof of defiance, proof that people can choose freedom over safety and moral truth over what society expects. This story reminds us that history isn't just what's written down in official papers, it's also what got left out on purpose, hidden, or erased completely. It lives in the empty spaces, in the silence between journal entries, in the pages torn out of diaries, in the family stories that shift a little with each generation. The real horror isn't just what happened, it's how well it got covered up, and how many similar stories may have left no trace at all. As night falls across Georgia from the mountains to the coast, picture these separated siblings, split apart by circumstance, by society, and by other people's choices, somehow still connected across time and distance. The surviving twin living his whole life in Georgia, haunted by dreams he couldn't explain. The twin who died young may be actually the wrong twin, mixed up in everyone's grief. And the third child taken away to the north, maybe growing into an adult who never learned where she came from, but still carrying it in her blood, her bones, the color of her eyes, and in dreams of places she'd never actually seen. 3 lives that started together on one single night, then scattered like seeds blown by different winds. One stayed rooted in southern soil. One got cut short before it could really grow. One got transplanted to faraway ground, where maybe it could grow free from the shadow of where it came from. All 3 were shaped by choices made in moments of crisis, fear, and courage, choices whose effects rippled through generations, reaching shores far from where they started. The real horror of this story, and maybe its strange beauty too, is that it never gets fully resolved. It's full of questions it can't answer, and pieces that hint at a bigger picture will never fully put back together. Like the torn journal pages, the water-damaged letters, the lost grave markers, and the family stories that change a little each time they get retold, we're left with an incomplete picture that our minds naturally want to finish. And in that effort, trying to understand choices made under pressures we can only partly imagine, we run into the biggest horror of all, realizing that in the same situation, we might make choices that would haunt us forever too. So what really happened to that third Whitaker child? Did she get to live a full life in Canada, free from the shadow of where she came from? Did she have kids, grandkids, descendants who are walking around today, carrying a history they might never know about? Did William Whitaker ever suspect the truth about his birth and the sibling who vanished? Did Charlotte Whitaker ever find the forgiveness she supposedly looked for at the end of her life? Did Ruth Anne Turner ever regret the dangerous choice she made? Or did she see it as the bravest thing she ever did in a life where she had so little control? We don't have clear answers to any of these questions. But just by asking them, we recognize the humanity of the people who lived through this, their fears, their hopes, their failures, and their moments of surprising bravery. As people looking back at history, we piece together little bits of evidence to build a story about the past. But we always have to remember these stories are just our best guess attempts to make sense of messy, complicated lives. The story of the Whitaker triplets, full of gaps and silences, reminds us how much we still don't know, how many stories got lost or buried on purpose, and how the full truth of the past might stay out of our reach forever. But even with all its missing pieces, this story still matters. It shows the terrible cost of rigid social systems, the impossible choices forced on people trapped inside them, and the occasional amazing courage of people who fought back against those systems at huge personal risk. It reminds us that the past isn't just the past, it keeps shaping the present in ways we can see and ways we can't. The end may be the biggest horror in the story of Charlotte Whitaker, Ruth Anne Turner, and the 3 children born that September night in 1843 is realizing that similar stories keep happening. Different details, but the same basic pattern wherever people draw lines between us and them, wherever systems force natural human bonds to be broken apart to serve made-up hierarchies, wherever parents and children face impossible choices because of circumstances out of their control. And maybe most importantly, this story pushes us to look harder at our own world, to ask what stories we might be hiding from ourselves, what truths we don't want to face, and what lines we keep at a terrible human cost. As we step back from this broken-up story, put together imperfectly from the pieces history left us, it's worth remembering that the past never really stays buried. It lives on in archives and attics, in family resemblances and dreams we can't explain, in patterns of who has advantages and who doesn't, passed down across generations. The real legacy of the Whitaker triplets and countless other people whose stories got broken up or erased just like theirs is still shaping our world today in ways we're only starting to understand. The Georgia pines still whisper in the wind, the red clay still keeps its secrets. And somewhere out there, maybe, descendants of all 3 Whitaker children are still living their lives, separated by choices that weren't theirs to make, but connected by bonds that go beyond time, distance, and every human attempt to break them apart.